Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our united progressive movement. With me today is Brandon Carpenter to be able to discuss his top priorities. Brandon, want to say hi to the Rosebuds out there?
Hey, what's up, Rosebuds? Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be able to talk to Brennan today. He wanted to really discuss how we can reform our democracy like so many of our guests do. It's our number one most popular subject. His second thing is he really wanted to address abolishing poverty. Again, one of our top subjects that are always discussed on this program. I think it's in our top three. And then his third subject he really wanted to talk about is one that I think is super important, but we don't get to talk about enough on this subject, which is climate change and the environment and trying to prevent some of the disaster that's there. But Brennan, before we get into those subjects, I wanted to let the audience know a little bit more about yourself. Do you mind letting the Rosebuds know where you're from as well as some of the stuff that you do?
Sure. I was born in Phoenix, grew up in a lot of different states, went to college in Utah. I was raised Mormon, and I served a mission in Brazil. And so I was knocking lots of doors and like spreading the gospel down in Brazil, and I saw a lot of poverty down there. It really got me thinking about inequality in the world and focused me on what more I could do to help people. And so when I came back to the States, I went to college. I got a political science degree, and I kind of thought I wanted to become like a permanent revolutionary and just fight as hard as I could throughout my life to make democracy work for everyone and make a society that works better for everyone. And so since then, I've been a volunteer organizer. I've worked on different campaigns in Utah, and then I worked on the Bernie 2016 campaign as well. I was actually the Utah County United Utah Party chairman. So that was another
Yeah,
third party
interesting.
effort that's still going on up in Utah. And they talked about a lot of the same stuff that Andrew Yang does: ranked choice voting, democracy reform. They said at one point like it's not left, it's not right, it's forward. Like 2 years before Andrew did, and then I moved back home to Phoenix, and as soon as I heard about Andrew Yang, I jumped on board. And I pay the bills. I'm kind of an Uber driver, and I do home inspections. So that's what I do when I'm not involved in politics.
Oh, well, that's certainly an interesting story of your life, Brennan. I think it shows so much of the purpose that you try and find in the work that you do and the advocacy you do, because it comes in many forms, but I think there's this innate reason that we see that there are those that are even worse off than we are, and we want to just work together to advance the human cause in general and not left, not right, but forward. So I think being able
Yeah.
to find yourself now to that Yang organizer and what this next journey is going to be now that the Yang 2020 campaign is gone will be certainly interesting to hear. But I want to talk about your number one subject because it's something I deeply care about too. It's my number one subject as well, which is democracy reform. But I think one of the things that's very broad in democracy reform is there's so many different ways you kind of can go at this. When you think about democracy reform, what are the subject areas you tend to focus most on?
So I mean, campaign finance reform has got to be the big focus, and I think it's easily achievable. I think that the Democratic Party has come so far in recognizing that the root cause of all of our problems, our corruption, is how much big money is in our politics. But obviously, we can't stop there. We need to actually be distributing money vouchers to people in order to include more of the poor and the marginalized communities that don't donate to political causes. We need ranked choice voting so that we can have multiple parties. I mean, I've studied like the Constitutional Convention, and I'm like a big fan of history. And what's crazy is that when they were drafting the Constitution, they were talking openly about preventing people from having, a complete choice
Mm.
in determining our government. They talked about the Senate actually being able to restrict the passions of the people. And So I think what we're doing here, this movement right here, is and the progressive movement as a whole is a reaction to the last 200 years of a government that has tried to restrain what people really want from it. So, yeah.
I think that's a very interesting point. Constitutionally, some of the basic structures of how we do government is really supposed to be representative. We've had to expand the vote on several occasions. Back in the day, it used to not just be you had to be white. It was you had to be white and property owning. Then it became white. Then you expand it to include minorities into the fold, but still just men. Then you give it to women. Constantly, we have been in this fight of revolution to have more representation for the people. And I think that's a great concept that we've again and again amended our Constitution to try and make it more representative of the people directly. And I think you're right that campaign finance reform is somewhere we need to start. In your opinion, what are the big first steps that need to occur to be able to drive some campaign finance reform going forward?
Well, I honestly, I trust, there's a lot of things that I can say about the Democratic Party that are big problems with it structurally, but I really believe that there is a consensus building to drive through campaign finance reform. And, a lot of the steps that I would suggest are already out there. Get involved with your local candidates that are running for the House and Senate seats that are progressive and put campaign finance reform front and center. HR 1 was passed by the House, and that would go a long way with, matching funds for donations. That would go a long way to at least get the process started. And I see it almost as like we'll build up a wave of change if we can just start getting more money into the hands of the poorer and more middle class Americans, and they'll be able to give that money back to other politicians that will continue the process. So we just got to get some points on the board, really, for that. Mm. And before we move on from that historical lens, I'd love to just pitch a academic paper that I have out on academia.org. You can Google this. It's called "The Suppression of American Revolutionary Populism." Bit of a mouthful, but in it I detail the history of how there were movements even back during the American Revolution of people who recognized that big money in politics was corrupting. There was a movement of populists during the founding of our country and after that were trying to take back the power, and they got beat down. And so, like, every step of the way that you were talking, John, about giving the franchise to more and more people, there has been a movement that has literally given their lives to accomplish this. So it kind of puts things in perspective for us.
Yeah, I think that would definitely be an interesting read. I think I'll check that out. Hopefully you can give me a link afterwards so I can share with everyone out there so that they can enjoy that read as well. I think one of the interesting points there that you make is kind of, it's a just got to put points on the board at some point. It's like we try and get these big packages, and I will give a shout out to John Sarbanes for his For the People Act, that HR 1 that you mentioned. But when we have these big packages, we haven't been able to push them through, because we still got to get them enacted, and so that requires some transformation on a Senate level, or it requires you to start having that waterfall effect of doing it state by state, where you go on your local legislative level to enact these policies. So I think it's kind of, we need to not be trying to fight for one huge package. I think we need to just keep adding them on one by one as reforms that are just common sense, and everyone's like, oh, how can we all disagree about this? This is a very simple one thing you have to agree on piece of legislation. I think that's one of my biggest things that I hate in the legislative process, is how large and expansive they try and make each piece of legislation. In some cases, it's understandable, but sometimes you're just throwing random things into something as sweeteners to certain Congress people, or as just political pawns within the game, rather than saying, does this make sense within this one piece of legislation? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Do you think we need to be making one grand push on democracy reform as a package deal like the For the People Act? Or do you think we have a better chance of trying to get it one issue at a time through?
That is a good question. I am very confident. I'm one of the probably I'm in the minority of the Yang gang where I think that the polling shows that Trump is on his way out, and maybe whoever gets nominated as a Democratic candidate is going to win the White House. Just how it looks to me from the data side of things, and then the Democrats have a majority in the House. I don't expect that to go away in an election year. More Democrats in a presidential election year, I mean, more Democrats usually come out, so I don't expect the Republicans to win back the House. But I will say the ballot propositions in the states have been very effective as well. We have one here in Arizona, Outlaw Dirty Money, and I see these guys with clipboards at all the events I do, getting signatures, and they're getting signatures from like all kinds of people just walking by. It makes me think that there's a lot of bipartisan support for these kind of ballot propositions, and a lot of independents too that are sick of the two-party system that will sign on to that. So I would say, as far as the people who are probably listening to this, you probably aren't in Congress, so your activism counts a lot more if you are working on a local level. So, tune into whatever group is pushing forward campaign finance reform in your state and see how you can get involved. It goes a much longer way.
Yeah, I think that's a very strong point. I think most of the people here, their activism is going to be in two levels. It's either helping someone who is a local representative, and that could even mean federal, like if you're having someone who's running for Congress in your area, you could still support. But getting involved in your local area and then fighting for individual causes. Because I agree with you. I think the ballot initiatives are one of the most strategic weapons we have for populist reform in a way, because it directly puts that vote to the people. In most cases, they know what's best for them rather than them trying to hold back that restriction, as you said, time after time to not represent the people. I think it was some Northwestern study that had basically said that regardless of what level of support any piece of legislation itself has, it's going to have a 30% chance of passing. But now, if you have wealthier people backing it, yes, it has much more of a chance to pass. And I think that's
Right.
the fundamental problem that we're all trying to get at. It's like, it feels like our advocacy at this point is useless unless you tackle the base incentive of why the people in government are governing by doing campaign finance reform. Do you think for campaign finance reform, there's a first lever that needs to get pulled? I think a lot of people always look at Citizens United as the first lever that's got to be pulled, because they say, okay, that's what allowed all the super PAC money and all the dark money into the system. But that's going to also require overturning a Supreme Court ruling and potentially a constitutional amendment. Do you think that's where we start?
Absolutely not, John. As much as I despise the Citizens United ruling, I think, we're seeing the direct effects of that ruling in this election cycle with Bloomberg and Steyer dropping tons of money and, lots of other groups getting involved. Uh, our whole system is just flooded with the money of the rich and powerful. But you're going to need a constitutional amendment for that. I know the Young Turks, they started the Wolf Pack that have been trying to push a constitutional amendment since 2011, and they're still like way short of the number of states
Yeah.
they need for that. And they've been fighting very hard. They're one of the most probably widespread and active groups that are pushing for a constitutional amendment and still not getting done. Ezra Klein just released his new book, Why We're Polarized, and in that book he details why, uh, you know, uh, our identities are tied up in parties. You and
Yeah.
I, and probably a lot of people that are watching this, we're independent minded. We like to dig into policy, but most people, that's not how it works. They take their cues
Nope.
from the party they like, and And that's really what's blocking us. We need to as a first step, I would say, even transparency in who is donating. There's so much dark money out there. If you could push, if you know you live in a red state, for example, you could still push transparency in campaign finance as a first step to raising awareness of where the money is coming from for a lot of these races. But um, you know, uh, anything and everything. You say throw the whole kitchen sink at the problem wherever you're at.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think transparency and just basic good governance practices of bringing a voice back to the communities and letting them know where you're getting funded, what you've actually been doing with your time, how their voice is actually being heard from the representative is really important because that's something we faced in my own district as a big problem. We have this representative who just wouldn't come and hear from us. And that's a big problem. Not like one specific group, but just even holding a town hall in general. I think that's the like relationship we want to build with so many of our institutions. Is we want to have more community feedback built in. It obviously comes as we're talking about here for democracy, but it comes in criminal justice as another area where we want to just be able to have more input as a third party kind of in those institutions that we've put so much trust in. Same with the media as well. I think there's a lot of calls for basic reforms in these practices. But I also think you're absolutely right that we gotta somewhat work within the system a bit more too. And I think some of those priorities you said um, deserve some credit when it's going through the system. Like I will have my disagreements with certain candidates that ran this cycle, like Michael Bennett, but he, as a senator, recently introduced legislation to encourage ranked choice voting. It was the Voter Choice Act. I think that was giving like $40 million in federal grants to different federal and state programs to introduce ranked choice voting. I think that is something where you can enact a program that builds in incentives to encourage people to embrace these systems. We always talk about how we want to incentivize the economy, but I think one of the things we have to talk about is how do you incentivize government itself to do what's right? Because that has a direct result on thus what our economy is as well. So I think that's very true as well. Before we go to our second part, is there anything else that you think really we need to be looking more at when it comes to democracy reform that is really being undervalued in the conversation currently?
Ooh, yeah. Glad you asked that. So I've been a fan of deliberative democracy studies. This idea that democracy can be a lot more powerful if you bring like a representative sample of citizens into a space and discuss different issues
Mm.
one on one. So if you type that into Google, you can find a lot of interesting stuff. And then there's also these new techniques that I've been hearing a lot about in the volunteer organizer world. It's called deep canvassing,
Hmm.
and this is the idea that like way before the race actually picks up, we should be canvassing, knocking doors, and talking to our neighbors in a different type of way that has been common. Nowadays you'll knock doors and you'll be like, "Hey, I'm here representing so and so. We'd really love your vote. It stands for this, this, and this." Whereas in deep canvassing, you're going up and you're like, "Hey, I'm a member of this neighborhood, this community. I've been here for so many years, and I'm trying to get an idea of what is important to my neighbors in the political system. Like, what do you care about?" And so it involves a lot more questions, a lot deeper conversations, and building up a relationship. And then you refer people in your neighborhood to local groups where they build up a sense of community. And
Oh,
they've shown with deep canvassing tactics that it's a lot more effective if you build that groundwork before an election cycle really heats up, to actually change people's minds on certain things. I think that's what we're going to have to do, especially for conservatives that think that democracy reform is like a way that Democrats are going to take the system from conservatives. I've heard a lot of stuff like that here in
Yeah.
Arizona. So we got to have deeper conversations with our neighbors to actually persuade them. And it takes a lot more work, but it's more effective.
Oh, I love that second idea of the deep canvassing. I think you're absolutely right that it's starting a conversation not when you're just trying to sell them something. You actually want to know what's important to them. You're building that relationship and you're building that network ahead of time. And I strongly agree that's definitely a better way to do politics in general because then you're actually going about saying, what am I running on? Oh, I know what they want. I'm going to go try and represent that idea of what they already want. I've already had that conversation with them and started to say, hey, I care about what you think before I even decide to run on anything myself. One of the things I appreciated during my very brief stint during campaigning is that would make all the worlds of difference. You want to know where the people are rather than just trying to sell them on where the people should go. That's really important a lot of times. Like sometimes, yes, you're going to add information into the fold, you're going to add perspective, but at the end of the day, your job is to represent. And so I think these ideas like deep canvassing really are going to be a lot of the future of democracy reform. But to the Rosebuds out there, I'm so glad you stayed tuned for this talk on democracy reform. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to come back to be able to talk about some really important aspects of why are we even doing democracy reform? Well, that might be to abolish poverty. So stay tuned. We're going to come back and talk to Brendon about abolishing poverty.